Hey guys, this is Jan for Chess24. We keep talking about the Sinquefield Cup in St. Louis, where round number 6 has been played as game of the day. I chose one of the evergreen encounters the chess world has to offer. Game between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura. Magnus Carlsen, the Norwegian world champion, has an excellent score against Hikaru Nakamura. But it has to be said that recently things have become a little harder for him in that matchup. He lost the first classical game to Nakamura in Bilbao in 2016. There's been a couple draws, so Magnus Carlsen no longer really dominating that matchup, but the overall score is still hugely in his favor. I chose that game as the game to cover, but I kind of quickly regretted my decision because, spoiler alert, it's a long, tense fight with a lot of territory that I don't understand particularly well. And not all that many flashy lines to show. So bear with me or switch off the video now after my excellent endorsement. Carlsen with white goes for 1 d4. Nakamura plays knight f6, c4, e6. Generally Nakamura has preferred classical openings against Magnus Carlsen. A lot of Queen's Gambit, no more King's Indians and Leningrad Duchess. And we get another Queen's Gambit. Knight to c3, bishop to e7, bishop to f4. Carlsen might have been inspired by Nakamura's loss in round number, which round was it? Round number 4, I believe, against Jan Nepomniachtchi. Because Nepomniachtchi chose this line against Nakamura, and Carlsen follows that game for quite a bit. Bishop f4, castles e3. Most top players used to play knight bd7 in this position. This has been more fashionable than c5. For quite a while now, Carlsen might have mixed feelings about this knight bd7 move because he lost a game here on the black side in his World Championship match against Vishy Anand. I believe the first World Championship match against Vishy Anand. Nakamura has shown for a while now that he prefers to go c5 here, go his own way with mixed results. After c5, d takes c5, bishop takes c5. The main line for white used to be Queen c2, knight c6, and now a3, where black was supposed to be in trouble, but Nakamura showed that he has some ideas up his sleeve here as well. I believe that he reintroduced the move rook e8 into top-level practice. Could have the position wrong, but I think it is here. And he showed some fresh ideas that could solve black's hopes in those lines. Therefore, people went back to playing the other main line, or the old main line. I don't know, moves go in and out of fashion, but a line we used to play a lot in the early 2000s, I would say. The move c takes d5 here. In a way, the most principled move. You want to play with an isolated pawn on d5? Be my guest, I will take on d5 and try to exploit that pawn weaknesses. Black goes knight takes d5, that's considered to be a better move than e takes d5, because this knight in some lines could stand in the way of the black pieces that would like to occupy this diagonal in order to attack the b2 pawn, while the knight on c3 is excellently anchored by that b2 pawn, attacks the d5 pawn. Therefore, this maybe is an exception to the rule, because normally with an isolated pawn you don't want to exchange pieces, but here knight takes d5 is better than e takes d5. Knight takes d5, now e takes d5, and we see another benefit of the knight from c3 having disappeared. White has to worry a little bit about bishop to b4 check. Therefore, in my days, the main move used to be a3, stopping bishop b4 check, knight to c6, bishop to d3, and after bishop to b6. Black was supposed to be slightly worse, but has been solving his problems in recent practice most of the time. Instead, the fashion has shifted towards arguably a more logical move, the move bishop to d3, just developing the bishop, preparing to castle, and threatening a little trick in the form of bishop takes h7, followed by queen c2 and queen takes c5. But it does have the drawback that after this check, which Nakamura plays, white has to go knight to d2 or loses right to castle. After knight to d2, the knight is slightly clumsily placed. However, you could argue that the bishop on b4 is not ideal either, so it's not clear who wins this dance of tempi in the end. Knight to c6, short castles. So far, both sides have followed the game Nepomniachtchi Nakamura from round number 4. But here Nakamura deviates, he does not go for the slightly passive move bishop e6 he played there. but instead goes for the move bishop to e7. Says his bishop has done his job on b4. I will reshuffle it towards f6 to attack the b2 pawn. Rook to c1, naturally enough, bishop to f6. And Carlsen ignores the attack on his b2 pawn, goes for knight to f3. Similar tactic to the one we've seen earlier. If black would take this guy, bishop h7, king h7, queen c2 check, picks up the bishop with a white advantage. Therefore, you gotta do something else. The first thought that crossed my mind here is the move bishop to g4. Turns out to be a mistake. The reason being that after h3, I want bishop h5 to keep this pin alive. But in this position, the move rook to c5 is very, very strong, surprisingly, because it threatens rook takes d5, and that's sort of hard to parry, let's say. Logical move, rook e8, rook takes d5, white wins. Queen d5, bishop h7. So rook c5 is extremely awkward because his bishop can no longer cover the d5 pawn. Therefore bishop g4 is not a great idea. Nakamura plays the move queen e7, maybe preparing bishop g4, because now this rook to c5 headache is gone. But Carlsen immediately stops it from happening by playing h3. Nakamura plays g6 in order to finally attack the pawn on b2 and take out this bishop takes h7, queen c2 check counter. But he played g6, not h6. But g6 also has some drawbacks. In some lines you could argue that it weakens the dark squares around the king. And Carlsen comes up with a very strong and surprisingly unpleasant move here. The move bishop to b5, which sent Nakamura into deep, deep thought, just targeting the pawn on d5 and the pawn, or the knight, but after one capture it would be the pawn on c6. And it's not clear what black should do about it. Most obvious move is to take on b2, but after bishop takes c6, there's a surprising amount of trouble. Let's say bishop takes c1. Currently black is in exchange up, but after bishop takes d5, he's still not out of the woods at all. Bishop a3, bishop to h6, very strong move. And after rook to d8, black would not be able to enjoy his extra exchange for much longer, because queen d4 hints at a very quick end of the game in form of queen to g7. That's just a sample line, of course, that shows the surprising amount of trouble that black is in. B takes c6, rook takes c6 also does not fully solve his problems. Bishop d6 is looming, rook to c7 is there, d5 pawn is still sort of weak. It's not easy to solve after bishop to b5. Nakamura comes up with a solution that both players seem to think was a good solution after the game, but I still don't think that it will find many followers. Black already has an unattractive position here. He goes for the move bishop to d7, covers c6, but is willing to give up the d5 pawn. After queen takes d5, he plays bishop e6, activating both his bishops, probably hoping to get his pawn back on the queen side. But on the other hand, c6 once again is a bit of a weakness now. Carlsen had a choice here. He went for queen e4, naturally enough, centralizing the queen. But there's also nothing wrong with the move queen to c5, which seems to steer the game towards a better endgame. After queen c5, rook c5. Black can take either pawn, but not both. For example, takes, rook takes c6. There's other moves here. Bishop takes a2 never works because of this. What do you call this? Skewer? Anyway, probably Carlsen thought that in some position like this, his winning chances would not be great. Even though instead of rook takes c6, knight g5, for example, might still be asking some question. World champion played queen to e4, and Nakamura does take his pawn back, goes bishop takes b2. Now, white had a choice. It was not bad at all to just remove the rook to c2 or even to d1. Here, I think white is better because of his extra central control and his active possibilities. Bishop d6, bishop h6, knight to g5 are all out there. Bishop takes c6, also still very much an option, while the black queenside majority still needs a long, long time before it becomes a factor. So rook cd1 was very much possible, but Carlsen goes for a more direct move, for the move bishop takes c6. His point is that if black recaptures, let's say b takes c6, after rook takes c6, he is a pawn up and there is no real compensation to be seen anywhere. While after bishop takes c6, if black plays the more obvious move, at least to me, bishop takes c1, then white would gladly take on b7. Say, okay, you're an exchange up, but I'm targeting your rook and I'm targeting your bishop. So good luck saving all of those. And indeed, the best black would have would be something like rook a b8, takes. And either rook takes c1 or maybe bishop d5 is even stronger. But white emerges with an extra pawn in all these lines. Nakamura had different intentions. And he says, I have to make sure your queen does not assist this bishop on b7. I have to kick it away and play move f5. Very committal decision, because f5 does weaken the black king. So if the queens were to stay on the board, then this could become quite a factor. But the queens will not stay on the board. Carlsen goes for a forced sequence here, starting with the move bishop to g5, which leads to most of the pieces disappearing from the board. He did have a very strong option, very computeresque option to keep the queens and keep the advantage too, though, starting with the move queen to b1, forcing black's hand. This bishop is under attack, so bishop takes c1, and now the star move that is pretty much impossible, or pretty tough to anticipate. It seems to work fine. Just bishop back to a4, saying, you know what, I'll be whole exchange down, but my pieces are better than your pieces. My king is better than your king. Oops. My arrows are worse than your arrows. So bishop to b3 is coming, knight to g5 is looming, bishop to h6. It's a surprisingly unpleasant position for black, which I'm not gonna analyze forever, but just to give you a sample line, bishop a3, bishop b3. Now this is a threat. Takes, queen takes, king to g7, bishop e5 check, king h6, rook fd1, and if black goes for the natural, rook a d8, all of a sudden his pieces end up being overloaded. White says, I was just kidding about trying to checkmate you. What I really want is to take all your pieces. And here, bishop g5. The queen can no longer control everything. White wins material. Not a forced line, of course, just to show you how strong the white initiative is. And Carlsen, had he found this move, queen b1, he would have put a lot of pressure on Nakamura. But but Carlsen, as mentioned, has spotted a different idea, which he likes. Bishop to g5, after which mass exchanges will happen. I tried to keep track about who has what material at what point. What I do know is that we will now get a series of 10 captures in a row, starting with f takes e4. And after all these captures, material will be roughly even. F takes e4, bishop takes e7, bishop takes c1, bishop takes b7. Black is currently an exchange up, but both his rooks are under attack by the white bishops. So probably that won't stay that way, while this bishop will get exchanged for this knight. But before the bishop loses his life, he says, you know what, give me that e3 pawn. This is very much the best move, bishop takes e3, and shows great tactical awareness by Nakamura, that you can't change the outcome of all the other traits, but you gotta get rid of the pawn. Bishop takes e3, bishop f8, rook f8, f takes e3, e takes f3, bishop takes f3. That concludes our series of 10 captures, and we have magically arrived at an endgame, where white has an extra pawn, but black's drawing chances are much bigger than white's winning chances here. The extra pawn is not that strong, the a2 pawn is kind of weakish. And if these pawns on the queen side get exchanged, black should also be a favorite to draw this. Nakamura correctly decides not to go for capture 11, bishop a2, rook a1, followed by rook a7, because that activates the white pieces. Instead he activates his own rook, goes rook b8, a4, rook b4, bishop to c6, rook to c4, not the only way, king g7 for example, like rook d1, a5 is pointed out by the computer as probably leading towards a draw. But rook c4, bishop b5, rook e4 is not ruining anything. Rook to d1, Carlsen saying, I don't want to defend this pawn. If you want to take it, be my guest, then I shall grab your a pawn. And if white is left with a passed a pawn, black is in a world of hurt. Therefore, Nakamura plays a stronger move, goes a6, making sure a pawn gets traded for a pawn. a6, bishop a6, rook a4. So the queenside pawns have disappeared, and the draw is still a favorite. The game is far from over, however, and Nakamura later was not very happy with his play below move 30 and 40 in that neighborhood. Or I think he said he played a good game for 25 moves, but after that something went wrong. This position should be a draw, but after bishop to d5, for example, Nakamura goes for bishop f5, when maybe, in hindsight, it was better to just take, grab some space, try to put these pawns on g5 and h5, and this rook endgame with 3 versus 2 should be a draw. Don't believe anything I say about rook endgames, but it does feel like a better version to the one we will get in the game, where bishop f5 was played, g4, bishop back to e6, and white has won some time, won some space to prepare for that same rook endgame. Well, the black pawns are a little more backwards now, harder to fight for space here. Rook a5, bishop takes e6, king takes e6, and this is the endgame in which we will spend a lot of the rest of the game. Where move 37, Carlsen correctly plays h4, grabbing more space and increasing his options. Maybe h5, maybe g5. For Nakamura, this is a tough decision. I have a feeling, and once again, don't trust my feelings on rook endgames, that h5 was the best move here, fighting for space. But in time trouble, you normally don't want to make committal pawn moves. And after g5, your g6 pawn is a little weak as well. So it's very understandable that Nakamura decides not to do it. He decides to keep the structure the way it is. But that gives Carlsen more chances. First the rook gets activated. And second, the king comes. Okay, for check e4. Covers the king. Advances the passed pawn. Rook a7 back. Rook b6 check. Rook b6 check might not have been the best move. But it seems like now the players have made it past the time control. Rook a7 was move 40, that the damage Nakamura has done to his position is already so serious that this position is objectively winning for white. And the fastest way to do this was to move king to g5. Now, because of the structure, black cannot stop the white king from setting up shop on the h6 square. And once it's there, it's going to be extremely tough to keep the h7 pawn alive. Well, there's all kinds of breakthroughs for white to queen his g pawn in the end. So king g5 would have won the game. Carlsen mentioned he didn't play because of king e5 when it looked like black had enough counterplay. And indeed, that would be the case after king h6, king to f4. It seems like black is quite active. But there is a very powerful move, rook to f1 here, cutting off the king from the f file. And after king takes e4, king h6. Turns out that even with equal material, black has just lost. White goes g5, rook f8, rook h8, takes and wins. For example, king e5, g5, rook a4, king h7. Rook h4, king g6. This is a winning position. Instead, Carlsen does play the move rook b6 check, not king g5. After king to f7, he decides to wait for a move with rook to c6. Here and on the next move, there was a very interesting option, which is confusing to me, but seems to win the game as well. The move h5. Honestly, I don't think this move would have crossed my mind at all during game, because we're taught that as the attacker you don't want to exchange more pawns, you want to keep as many pawns as possible on the board. But it turns out that here it's more important to create new weaknesses in the black position. After h5, gh, gh, I think we'll analyze something like that a move later, that the access towards the h7 pawn that is gained by clearing the 6th rank might prove decisive. Let's look at it here, rook c6, rook d7. And now, after h5, gh, gh, what looks natural to me would be to activate the rook. The rook d1 is very well met by king to e5, hiding from any potential checks. There is just nothing that black can do, surprisingly. Let's say rook to h1, rook f6 check. Very, very strong move, asking the black king to commit. King e7, rook h6 picks up the pawn and wins. Well, if the king goes to g7 or g8, h6 check. Locks the king up, because the pawn endgame is lost. And with the king locked up like this, white would just win the game, apparently. Once again, all of this came as news to me. The move h5 was pointed out to me while we were watching this live by Dutch Grandmaster Jan Smits, who felt very sure that this was trouble without consulting any computers. So kudos to his rook endgame instincts. And let's have a look at what the world champion did here. I do believe that we have a bit of video, all video used here, courtesy of the Grand Chess Tour. They were kind enough to allow me use it from the official, allow me to use it from the official live stream. Here, this was not a picture. Nakamura is actually moving. Carlsen's weighing his options. He's gonna move a pawn, but he goes for the g pawn instead. He goes for the move g5, and the move g5 does seem the end of his winning ambition almost. Like, the game will continue for a while, but after g5 there's no more h5 and recapture, and there's also no more inroads for the king towards the h6 square. And therefore, yeah, I believe this helps Black's defense considerably, even though it will not stop Carlsen from trying. This is move number 43, and what he does is the typical technique. If you have a rook endgame where you see no clear path to victory, you move around a little bit. So I will jump ahead just a tad. This is move number 43. Let's jump to move number 75, a mere 32 moves. The position after move 75 is this one. Doesn't look that different, does it? Rook f6 check has just been played, asking Nakamura where he plans to put his king. It turns out that king g7 is wrong, because after e5, e6, the white e-pawn becomes too strong. So the king has to stay in contact with this e-pawn, has to go to e8. And Carlsen plays his last card, goes for the move h5, trying to break up the black pawns now. Clearing an inroad for his king. Gh, pawn to e5. This is still very tough to defend, but Nakamura finds an excellent move, which I'm not sure I'll be able to explain, but it is very clever. He goes for the move rook to f7. What does this move do? First of all, it stops white from going rook h6, and it also stops white from advancing further, really. If he were to move his king to e4, which I think he does once, then rook g7 happens, and the king once again has to go to the f-file to defend his g-pawn. If he goes for e6, Black should not take, but instead he can go rook f8. He can also go rook a7, because having provoked e6, this pawn becomes more of a target, and it limits white's options. But he can also go rook f8 here. And then after king to f5, go h4, distract the king, king g4, and king to e7. It turns out that Black is defending successfully in every variation. Let's say rook h6, rook f1. Now with the pawn on e6, it will always get exchanged, and the game is a reasonably straightforward draw. Instead, Carlsen played king to e4, rook g7, king to f5, but the same principle applies. Rook to f7, once again provoking e6 or asking white what else do you want to do. Carlsen waits with king f4, and Nakamura decides to play the move h5, h4. Same principle. If the king goes after this pawn, which he does, then we attack the pawn that is no longer defended by the king. And if this pawn is forced to advance, which it is here after e6, then it becomes a target himself, and the black defense gets much easier. Rook to a7. This rook now gets activated. Well, the king keeps an eye on both the h7 pawn and the e pawn. Therefore, this position all of a sudden a reasonably straightforward draw. Carlsen tries a little longer, but sooner or later h-pawn and e-pawn get exchanged for each other. Oops, and here the king is well placed to deal with the g-pawn. Earlier we had a position that was winning for white, but that was with the king cut off. The king on the 8th rank is not an issue here. Now if you are confused by everything that happened in this game, and I wouldn't blame you because I'm confused by most of it, then I want you to at least remember one thing, and that is in this position. If your opponent has a g-pawn on the 6th rank, or anywhere really, it is perfectly fine to defend passively. Keep the king on g8, put your rook on the back rank, and there is nothing white can do to make progress. This technique does not work with an f-pawn, or an e-pawn, or a d-pawn, or a c-pawn, but it does work with a g-pawn. Because after, let's say rook g7, king h8, Rook h7, king g8. There is no way for the white rook to go further to the right. If it could go to rook i7 here, then white would win. But there is no further squares. Therefore, this position is just a draw. And it's important to know that against the g-pawn, you can defend passively like this. No progress to be made. Obviously, both these guys know that quite well. Therefore, I believe in this position after rook e8. Peace negotiations finally did happen. Let's see. Yeah. Is this a draw for by Carlsen? Nakamura on move 94 still looks a little tired maybe from all the defensive work he had to do, but he did keep his ground. He did manage to defend that unpleasant rook endgame, and he earned a hard-fought draw. Hikaru Nakamura with the black pieces probably is the happier side, at least as this game concludes, because he was under pressure for a big part of it. Let's have a look at the standings, if I can bring them up. Here we are. Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, the Frenchman, still in the lead after he defeated Magnus Carlsen in a similar long, complicated game. Magnus Carlsen in second place, together with Levon Aronia and Vishy Anand on +1, 3.5 out of 6, while Hikaru Nakamura on -1, 2.5 out of 6, but with a tough defensive drop in this game. That's it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something new about rook endgames. I certainly did. That h5 move is still very confusing to me, but it does seem to be a good move. Who would have thought? Anyway, see you in the next one. Bye.